Okay, so we're going to begin closing off the last few little chapters here with some related topics. That's to say, things that are going to be using a lot of the same piping, a lot of the same parts, a lot of some general areas of the body. And so we'll start here with the simpler of those two systems here. This is the urinary system. And really, when we think about the urinary system, the only real honest moving part in all of this is the kidney. Okay, and what the kidney is doing for us is it's doing a lot of different things. It plays some of the roles we've talked about before already. We talked about regulating blood pressure, and doing so by regulating blood volume, right? By how much water do we pull out of the blood to put it into the urine, how much do we put into the urine and pull out of the blood, and so on, whatever, vice versa. And in doing so, we manage water balance that way. We also, the means by which we do that is by moving solutes, particularly sodium, but other things in and out of the blood there as well. So it regulates solute concentrations. It helps to maintain acid-base balance. We get rid of metabolic wastes. Primarily here we think about things from the breakdown of amino acids. We get rid of toxins, drugs, non-soluble or water-soluble vitamins and megadoses. All those sorts of things come out of here. When we talk about functionality here, we can think about it in terms of what is it doing. Obviously, there's endocrine functions here related to a couple of different things. We've talked about both of these hormones before, both renin, here on my pen, renin as the blood pressure regulator here, and erythropoietin here. We talked about the production of the maturation of red blood cells. It also plays a role in the regulation of vitamin D, which we need for a number of different purposes. Gluconeogenesis, so again, we talked about this in the last chapter, where we rebuild glucose from pyruvic acid or other spare parts, okay, in order to keep the central nervous system going. So obviously, right, these kidneys here, these guys, these are the single most important part of this whole deal here. And the rest of the urinary system is mostly just piping and storage. So we've got ureters here, which are there to move what is eventually going to be the urine from the kidney, takes that urine down to the urinary bladder. Now, if you want to use the term bladder here instead of urinary bladder, I'm not going to be upset by it. Be aware, of course, there are other bladders in the body, things like the gallbladder. And so there are people who will say, well, what bladder? You just say bladder. For here, it's fine, but just be aware of that as a thing to think about. And then leaving the urinary bladder, we have one more piece of piping here. That is the urethra that takes the urine out of the body. If we look at where all these parts are, right? Kidneys here, pretty high up on the body, honestly, surprisingly high up on the body, maybe. Here's a diagram for reference sake. The kidneys sit almost all the way up on top of that. They're pushed down just by the presence of the liver, which sits right here, the stomach, which sits right here. Other than that, they are about as high in the abdominal cavity as you can possibly go. From there, coming down out of them on both the right and left sides, we have the ureters, feed into the urinary bladder here in the pelvic cavity, and the urethra on the way out. We're going to start with the kidneys here in terms of anatomy. There's just more anatomy here. Number one, it's also the more important bit of anatomy. As for where they sit in that abdominal cavity, we've already talked, like I said, about them relatively high, right, covered by the ribs, 11th, 12th, the floating ribs in both cases. They're also within that abdominal cavity retroperitoneal. They are behind the peritoneum. They are, if we go back to this diagram here, you can see that the right kidney is a little bit lower than the left one, right? You can see that also here, right? Right kidney lower than the left. That's, of course, because of that guy right there, the liver, pushing that down a little bit farther than the stomach does. On top of each of these kidneys, there is a adrenal, sometimes suprarenal, this is getting pretty messy, gland that sits on top of that, the adrenal gland. We've talked about that guy before. As always, I'm going to see if I can find a different picture here to show you. We have a point at which a bunch of stuff enters and leaves the kidney. And so that surface, just like we talked about before, we'll say the spleen, right? That surface is called a hilum. So we have a hilum on the kidney, right? Renal hilum, technically, if you want to. And that's where ureters exit, blood vessels enter and leave, the lymphatics leave, nerves enter and leave, all of that good stuff. It is an encapsulated organ, so there is a capsule surrounding it, both a fibrous capsule, right, which helps to kind of quarantine, if you will, the kidney from the rest of the abdominal cavity. We also have a fat capsule that sits around it, perirenal fat capsule. So in addition to the ribs covering us up, we also have fat surrounding each of the kidneys there as well. If you've ever eaten kidneys before, obviously not human kidneys, I hope not human kidneys, but if you've ever eaten kidneys from a deer, from a cow or a sheep, you know that they're pretty fatty when they come out. Inside the kidney, we're going to divide it up again, as we have before for so many other organs, into outer cortex and inner medulla. The cortex, we'll see pictures of this in a second here. This is going to be the structural part, the supporting part, okay? And it's going to surround and kind of separate out the medullary tissue, which breaks down into what we're going to call pyramids. Those pyramids are going to be tipped. They're pyramids, so they're triangular, right? So the very tip of that pyramid that points into the kidney, called the papilla, right? And the pyramid and the cortex that surrounds it together is called a lobe. And there are about 8 of these in a given kidney. Sometimes there's 7, sometimes there's 9, but usually 8 is a good average number. Those papillae point inward to a central cavity, okay? That central cavity, eventually we get all the stuff pulled down into it, and that becomes the renal pelvis. And we'll see in a minute why we call it a pelvis. It kind of looks like your leg coming off of your hip there. Between the renal pelvis and the papilla, we have what are called calyces. Singular here. Bear with me as my laptop screen moves. C-A-L-Y-X is the singular here. Minor and major calyces, or a calyx. These are just the connecting points between that central hub, that renal pelvis, and where fluid is coming out of the pyramids. So our pathway of flow here, we create filtrate and urine in the renal pyramid. It drains into a minor calyx, which flow together into major calyces, which flow into the renal pelvis and out of the kidney via the ureter. And again, we'll see a picture of this right here. So thinking about our anatomy here, I'll use the real kidney for this. We've got this light colored tissue all the way around, right? This is the cortex, and this darker stuff in the middle here, say right there, is the medullary tissue. This guy right here, I'll just draw him out if I can get my pen to work. There we go. This guy right there is a pyramid. This guy right here is a pyramid. This guy right there is a pyramid. Okay. And if we take the pyramid and all of the cortical tissue surrounding it, maybe I'll use the cartoon for this. It's a little bit better to see this. All of this together, okay, is a lobe. All right. So we've got the cortex, we've got the pyramid, the medullary tissue, and then separating out each lobe, okay, we have what are called the renal columns, which is a little bit of cortex here and there. Again, separating those things out, but also forming part of this lobe. Our pathway here is going to be from the pyramid into right here, which is the minor calyx, which drains into a major calyx right there, major calyx right there, which drains into the renal pelvis down into the ureter and out of the kidney. As far as the blood and nerve supply goes, we have a renal artery and a renal vein. We get a fairly large amount of blood moving through these kidneys on a regular basis. About a quarter of your total cardiac output every minute passes through your kidney, which is pretty good. And your nerve supply is, as far as we can tell, entirely sympathetic. Now, once we get in a little bit deeper into the anatomy here of, say, within a lobe, and we look at the functional anatomy here in terms of generating eventually what will become urine, the structure that's going to be responsible for making that urine within the lobe is called a nephron. In the nephron, there are north of 1 million of these in every kidney. Obviously, the more lobes you have, the more nephrons you're going to have, so on and so forth. There's a lot of them, I guess, is the end story on that. They're broken down into two parts. We have the first part called the corpuscle, okay, and this is where we're going to be actually filtering the blood. And then the remainder of this, the tubule, is going to be what takes that filtrate, okay, the stuff that we pull out of the blood, and we adulterate it and make it into urine instead in that tubule. So we'll start here with the corpuscle. Renal corpuscle, two parts to this. We have the glomerulus. Okay, and the glomerulus here is the capillary part of this. So this is where the blood is actually passing through. And this glomerulus is surrounded on most sides, not all sides, but on most sides here, we'll call the glomerular capsule, or if you're an old fart like me, the term Bowman's capsule is the one you'll be familiar with. I'm probably going to use the term Bowman's capsule, but either term is fine. And this is going to be kind of where we collect the fluid that we're filtering out of the blood. Okay, so the blood passes through this glomerulus, it gets kind of pushed out and filtered out, and we create this fluid called filtrate, which is what this guy is right here. And that filtrate gets collected by the Bowman's capsule. There are two parts to this. I'm not overly worried about, honestly, remembering these two parts. I just want to point out again, like most membranes, there is a parietal and a visceral layer to them. The tubule, on the other hand, is a little more important, a little more complicated, because there's multiple stages involved in converting filtrate to urine. And so each of those different stages here happens in a different part of this. So we have a proximal convoluted tubule, or what we call the PCT, the nephron loop in the middle, okay, and the distal convoluted tubule, or DCT, on the farther end. And again, I'm just going to show you a picture here real quick. Oh, I'm not going to. We'll skip ahead here. Show you a picture here real quick of what that looks like. Maybe. No, apparently not. Okay. What I'm going to do instead, I think, is I'm going to just show you a video so you can see it happen in real time and how this stuff works. Basically, the idea is that we've got our Bowman's capsule and our glomerulus right here. We're going to come out and we're going to have a little bit of a wiggle. This is the PCT here. Then it's going to drop down into the medulla, come back up. This is nephron loop here, and then we've got another little bit of a wiggle, and then we enter into a collecting duct. This back here is the distal convoluted tubule. So it's going to have that kind of appearance to it. The PCT is entirely cortical. I guess that's really what I'm primarily focused on at this point. Two processes here. We'll talk about these in the next section here. Reabsorption and secretion. This has to do with the movement of things out of the blood and into the filtrate, and the movement of things from the filtrate back to the blood. Like I said, we'll talk about those here in a minute. Just be aware that CT does both. The nephron loop, sometimes we call this instead here loop of Henle. Right, so again, another kind of old-fashioned term here that sometimes we use. Loop of Henle, nephron loop, the same thing. And this is the part that kind of comes down out of the cortex and into the medulla and loops back up. Okay, so we have a descending limb coming down and a descending limb coming back up. And then the distal convoluted tubule here, this is again the last part of this before we fully just kind of dump this stuff out into a collecting tubule. Again, entirely cortical, does both, right? Does both secretion and reabsorption, but really mostly secretion as a process. If we come back here to this guy, we're going to see, again, things move into and out of, particularly water and sodium move into and out of the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. Okay, so we'll call it good there. And on the next section here, we'll get into a little bit more of the physiology of what's happening. We'll talk about what reabsorption is. We'll talk about what secretion is, and all of that good stuff.